Hey everyone, welcome back. This is Styler Origins, second season or season two. And I am very happy today to have an awesome guest, a good friend from the LinkedIn world that now I hope one day I can hang out with him and we can actually share more. But his name is Tim Bruce. He's known as the training guy. He's not only a training guy today in the industry, but is also uh, a veteran as well, just like I am. And thank you for your service as well. And I'd like to welcome Tim. Hey, Tim, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Great. Well, if you're listening, folks, we're doing a great episode today. We're going to talk about training design and how everything kind of evolved, where did it all start, and what are the good practices? I mean, that is Tim's job today. He's going to tell us good stuff, his thoughts about good practice with designing training. I'm going to play my nerdy side, as always, and dive a little back or bring a little bit of fun facts, fun facts. Then neither fun nor facts. No, sometimes they're facts, but they're not always fun. At least they're fun to me. So, it's going to be a great episode. So we're going to get into it and talk about it. But,
So I'll tell the story and then you'll tell the actual science behind the story.
yeah, we can talk about the story, and then we could also talk about as we like to do it here in the podcast, is kind of like tie in the original thoughts, right? The original history of it that perhaps has been lost in substance over the years, and what the industry talks about today or what we get to do today. Sometimes, I know that you have suffered this a little bit. I suffer as a training delivery specialist. I suffer as an instructional designer and as a learning developer, in the sense that sometimes we're stuck just developing content and not really challenging the status quo. And challenging the status quo sometimes can get you fired. Some people know about that.
There's a backstory there.
That's saying, oh, yeah. Yeah, it's me. All right. So here's an interesting quote that I'm going to bring in from a great magazine. And let's not confuse it with the magazine known as Training Magazine. But this is actually a magazine from 1912, or at least this issue is from 1912. And it's called Manual Training Magazine. So it's an interesting topic because today, what most people talk about to actually apply knowledge or apply knowledge transfer or apply their skills is known as what? What would you say to that, Tim? What is the phrase that we use to like actually apply something? What kind of training is that? Let's see if I
Performance-based training.
Okay, so that's you're way out there. You're in the highest level. I know I brought the high caliber guy in here, but I'm gonna make it easier or make it simpler. So hands-on training.
Right? Oh, there you go. Yeah.
Hands-on training. And we say hands-on. Funny enough, back in the 1900s or 1912, that period of 1910 through 1926, they call it manual training, which is basically the literal form, manual, hands, the Latin word, mano, because I speak Spanish, mano. So the manual training. And interesting thing that's mentioned in this magazine, at least, one of the lines, not gonna read the whole thing, but I'm gonna give you guys the link. So make sure you check the description, whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to Spotify, that there's a line here that I love. It's just, it's golden. It's golden. So it kind of says, it's talking about the differences between pedagogy and adult learning, or the actual application of knowledge. And it says, the pedagogical assumption underlying the work in its beginnings was that the young pupil was not able to draw anything until he had mastered the alphabet of drawing by a laborious drill on lines and plane figures of all possible shapes and in all conceivable positions. And so it says, the person who paraphrased the saying, nothing succeeds like success, will match to our watchword of the day, which is the best way to learn how to draw is to draw. What do you think about that, Tim?
Yep, that's true. That's so true.
I mean, that's what lands, right? Like, So I mean, we're talking 1912, folks.
Right. It's like riding a bike. You
Yeah.
can't learn how to ride a bike from watching a PowerPoint presentation.
Right. So why do you think that we have this conflict today where, I mean, we have a lot, we already seen a lot of the conversations about learning styles and other things, but when it comes to training design, what is getting in the way? What do you think is the barrier to having performance-based or effective training?
Yeah, and I post about this all the time on LinkedIn. But constant conversation is, I think a lot of it just has to do with organizational structure. The training element, whether it's called L&D or whatever it's called within a large organization or medium organization, they're considered part of HR, and their function is to administer the training, right? But when it comes to the content, and rightly so, the content is usually owned by the subject matter expert or the area within operations that performs that function. And so they develop the content for the training and they give it to their L&D organization and go, here, put this out, right? And because, we talked about my moniker as the training guy, everybody has experience with training so they can associate with it. But because they associate with it, they assume they also have some expertise in it and don't really take into account the expertise within their organization that, no, we've studied how people learn and why people learn and when people learn, right? And those three things matter. And so that effect has to be created within the content most of the time. You have to make them want to know it. You have to give it to them at the right point in time so that it is effective, right? If you give it to them too early, they're going to forget it. If you give it to them too late, they don't need it anymore. And then their internal motivation is, if they don't need the training or they don't want the training, they're not going to accept the training. They're not even going to engage with the training. We talk a lot about, employee engagement as the buzzword. Well, if you give it to them when they want it and when they need it, they're going to engage, right? But if you give it to them when, too early or too late, well, why should I bother?
Yeah. I agree. I agree with what you're saying there. That whole proximity to the actual application, because that's actually what you're looking at, is the experience, right? The application of the concept at times. So if you train someone, 3 weeks ago, you trained someone 3 weeks ago how to change oil, and they didn't actually do it on a vehicle, then it's going to be,
right.
We can tap into many things in there, but people will talk about, like forgetting curve and whatever the case. Okay, right. Great. And that's good for recall. But, distributed practice and specificity of training per se, or, deliberate practice, that's another thing, right? So training on the actual things that you're going to do. And for that is an interesting thing here. In 1920, there's a book called and I mean, you got to understand, I think we have to understand that in the 1900s, at least the beginning, because of the Industrial Revolution, right? That's exactly where training really picks up. I mean, we can talk about learning all the way back to the Chinese philosophy and Confucianism. Zhengzi, right. He said that human nature is evil, and the only way to correct it is moral education. That was the philosophy at that point.
Socrates, right? Socratic method.
It was, it's the Socratic method afterwards, right? Yeah. So I think this guy's going to be I don't know who's first. I have to check that. It's like, who's first, who's on second? But but yeah, Socrates had the Socratic method, and for those that don't know what that is, we'll tap into that in another episode. It's the ability to learn, through questions, which is another thing today that perhaps is being a little bit lost. The ability to, inquire and ask people open-ended questions so they can formulate their thoughts and, give you back whatever it is in their TikTok computer, in their space lacking TikTok, Twitter, Instagram computer, which we call brain.
But going back to that, to your question was, what is the barrier? The barrier is, I think, again, the organizational structure, and that everyone has their familiarity with training, right? How they learn to be the expert in what they are. Well, they went through this certain experience and have all of this knowledge, and so they assume that everyone else has to have that same experience. And because the way the organization is structured, the L&D organization or the L&D employee within the organizational structure can't go back to that senior manager, leader, executive and go, that's crap. You know,
Right.
we can tell them, no, this is how people learn. And they go, sorry, but this is my program. These are my employees getting this training. I want them to know all of this stuff. And so based on the way the organization is structured, L&D is going to go, okay, here's your stuff, right? Here's your sign and give it to them the way that they ask for.
Right.
And we push back as much as we can. But realistically, at the end of the day, when that senior manager or that executive says, I want it this way, that's what they're going to get. And is that wrong? Not particularly. It's just the way that it is. We know that at some point they're going to overcome that obstacle that we put in their way by giving them too much information or unnecessary information or information at the wrong time. They're going to overcome it at some point. And if we're smart, we'll help that senior manager, that executive start evaluating the outcome of their learning so that we can go back and say, well, here might be a better way to do that, or here's why it's not as effective as you may think it needs to be, if we get the chance to do that. But again, just the general structure of the way organizations are set up, that's a barrier. And you can relate to this, Alex, is, the way the military is structured, training is a major component of the military organization. Every military branch has a training component that is equal to all of the other components, whether it be, strategic air command or armored division, right? Or armored command. Training is an equal component. And so when all of the leadership is sitting in the room, one of those leaders is from that training component. And so when they're hearing we're getting a new weapon system, we're increasing the number of personnel, or we're increasing the number of these type of personnel, they're looking at it from the training perspective and going, how's that going to impact us down the road? Whereas in the modern organization, because training is a subcomponent of HR, and they're hearing that there's something happening, they may be thinking about how it's going to impact training, but more than likely they're thinking about what is my workload for recruiting or payroll or whatever other functions are affected by that. And training is not a strategic component of that organization.
It's true. It's true. And well, it's there's also, I think we got like combinations of things. There's many variables involved. For one perspective, I think what you mentioned there, what gets in the way of good training design, in defining what that is, right? So, I mean, training design, we have to separate training from learning. I think a lot of people, the problem that we have in this industry that we keep changing the name every 5 years.
Yeah.
And I think is also a way to, I don't know, to me, it seems to be maybe I have conspiracies here, but I'm half Cuban, so that's very natural to have conspiracies. But but I'm going to give you a line here from 1920, right? From this book of Training Industrial Workers by Dr. Brewer, PhD. You see the links on the description of the episode. But the opening line is, in the industrial world of today, every worker needs training. This need grows not alone out of the necessities of the employee, but out of the interests of the employer and of the public as well. So how many private enterprises today do you think of this way? Think of that line there of what we're talking about. So definitely there's the interest of the employer. What you mentioned is more of a, hey, we hire these training people, they're going to make training content, they're awesome, but they're going to make what we want. But the mention of the public as well, because back then we seem to be a little bit more altruistic, right, in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the current thought as a business owner is, okay, how can I do this in the most cost-effective way? And so public good doesn't really factor into that equation.
Right. And I'd like to remind our viewers, if you listen to any episodes on season 1, we have some good history back there that with training and everything that we know today. So all these big principles we know today about training come from 2 places. 1919, the Emergency Fleet Corporation. There's an episode of that about Charles Ricketson Allen, who implemented the Herbartian Steps, which is a teaching, probably the most effective teaching method that was implemented in 1900s or late 1800s in our school systems for whatever reason that is still used today, but they don't refer it to be the Herbartian Steps. And Herbart was some Friedrich Herbart, German guy, educator, of course. And then don't forget that we also have another episode on TWI, which is the Training Within Industry movement. And that saved our butts in World War II. Otherwise, we'll be here speaking German. Yeah. So I'd like to make sure you check the links because you're going to find some cool things there. I don't know if you ever heard anything about this thing, but the folks that were involved in TWI, they picked up the word from C.R. Allen, Charles Ricketson Allen. There was another gentleman by this name, Charles Allen Prouser, I think, C.A. Prouser. There's actually a Prouser Institute out there that teaches, it's in Indiana. It appears to be an alternative for kids that go to high school. Instead of, going to high school, they're training in the trades. So they're training in actual jobs, right? Trade jobs. And that's because these guys work for vocational education. So vocational education is from where we get all these training principles that we know today. I mean, many of the training principles. I'm not talking about cognitivism, like, the stuff that people like to always throw around, like a cognitive load theory and whatever theory and whatever. I'm talking about the actual practice there. So the question that I have for you is on that. We talked about the barriers of training design being what people want to do, what the workers want to do, and what the employer wants, right? And there's reduction of money, the reduction of time, but there's also, I think, that creates a vicious cycle, sort of a vicious cycle. You think? So, like, the employer says, hey, just do it. Just put it in a PowerPoint, right?
Right.
Then our training folks put it in a PowerPoint. And then they want to make that PowerPoint the flashiest PowerPoint, the most beautiful PowerPoint there is. So you kind of get hooked up on that. Right?
Yeah, and there's a lot of when I was on staff at the Air Force Academy, a lot of the current staff were graduates of the Air Force Academy. Now, I, being an enlisted guy, was not, right? So I had no vested interest parochially for what we were doing there. Where I had a vested interest was these guys were going to graduate, and all of a sudden I'm saluting them, right? They're my boss in the chain of command. They outrank me. And so that was my vested interest. So I wanted them to be outstanding officers, knowledgeable in just basic military disciplines. And what happens a lot in for example, where I'm at now within the IRS, we have people that they went through this particular training program and they turned out okay. And, you know, you can't really argue that they didn't, right? And this, you know, same thing happened to Air Force Academy. I mean, these generals would come in and go, why are you doing that? I did it this way. And I'm a general now. So yeah, you turned out okay. And I would argue that you turned out okay in spite of the bad habits or the bad methodologies that you were introduced to in your training, as opposed to if we would have, you know, use the rock solid principles that we know work, and skip the ones that we know don't work.
Yeah.
But because there is, you know, everyone draws on their own experience, I think that kind of goes to your question. You know, that's where a lot of that comes from.
All right. So I'm going to put it this way to you. I'm going to explain this process to you, and you let me know what you think works or is right based on what you know today. All right. I'm not going to tell you what it is. It's going to tell you how it's done and the guidance, and then you tell me your opinion on it or what you think it is or not. So step one is preparation, right? So preparing the learner. You're going to put the learner at ease, find out what he or she already knows about the job, and get him interested and desirous to learning the job. So that's step one. There's three little in that phase. Are you good with that?
Yep, we call that motivation.
Good. All right. So you're talking about motivation. Great. So step two is presentation of the operations and knowledge. Instead of, I guess this should have been phases and then inside steps, but we're going to go with this. So in that second phase, you have the first step, which is tell, show, illustrate, and question in order to put over the knowledge and operations. So remember that I told you about that difference in the phraseology before we started the episode. Put over, right? Put over really means knowledge transfer. You know, like transferring the learning. So tell, show, illustrate, and question, right? So I will tell you what it is, show you how it's done, then give you some visualization of it, and then from there, go and question you about it or give you some questions to elicit your recall. That's just the first part of that presentation. The second part of the presentation will be instruct slowly, clearly, completely, and patiently, 1 point at a time, right? So you're still good with that? You agree with that? All good there? All right. The next thing is I'm going to check, question, and repeat, right? So I'm going to check everything we just done so far. All right. Do you know it, Tim? Yeah, good. I'm going to question you about it, and then we're going to repeat that. And the last part of that is make sure the learner really learns, right? So far, we're still good? Is that still?
Yeah,
we're not done yet. We're not done yet, but
all right. I'm good. I'm good. I have a question when you get time.
Absolutely. So then we're gonna have what is called the performance tryout. In the performance tryout, you're gonna test the learner by having them perform the job. Ask questions beginning with why, how, who, when, and where. Observe the performance, correct the errors, and repeat the instructions if necessary. I think that takes care of the thing you were mentioning about that some people go through well, and then continue until you have verified that that person knows what they're doing. Okay, that's the third phase. So far, no problems there. All right. And the last piece of this is called the follow-up. So on the follow-up, you're going to put the learner on their own after you're done all this, right? You're going to put them on their own and then check frequently to make sure that everything ties, they follow the instructions. So in other words, they stick to the process. And then taper off extra supervision and close follow-up until they're qualified to work with normal supervision. And that is what we know to be called, based on the Herbartian steps, but that's actually one of the J methods that was designed in the 1940s or the TWI. It's called the job instruction method. It actually is the job method that was brought in 1919, but it was improved by these folks in 1940. So the question that you had is what?
You answered it. You answered it.
Oh, okay.
You answered it. It was in the next step. It was like, yeah, okay. And so, yeah, it's just constant reinforcement
Right.
until, yeah.
And I think if we're doing, it doesn't matter. The one thing today in the last message that we can give here, because we're about to close up, but the one thing I could say is, I think it doesn't matter what your delivery methodology is. This is what you need to do in terms of providing good instruction for anyone in a work setting. Of course, we have the ADDIE instructional process that came up out of the IPISD model in the 1970s, which is basically what you followed or you got to know about being in the Air Force and in the Navy, everybody else in the Navy, and everybody followed that process. And that's what most people today call the ADDIE model. They just don't dive into the 19 steps that are in there for the whole design of a program, right? Because it's a program. This stuff that we're talking about here, these 4 phases, they're just really just instruction, like, being able to teach. And as I say,
well, and it kind of follows the Gagne 9.
The 9 events of instruction from Gagne. Yeah. 9 events of instruction from Gagne, yes. And he got that revelation. Actually, I have a quote that I'm going to put here at the end of the video, but I have a quote from Gagne that actually talks about how he learned from the military that is task instruction, that it was the best way to perform instructional design. So, yeah, that one's sinking there. Yeah. And thank you so much for being in the episode. I want to ask you, what's the message you want to give the listeners in terms of what we discussed today, effective training design? What are your tips?
Gosh, well, tip number 1, follow Alex. He kind of knows, and actually there are several people on LinkedIn
of course,
that you should probably follow and just learn from, and ask questions. And that's really the great thing about the learning community is we do help each other learn. When I started in LinkedIn, like most people, I was looking for a job. But then as I got into e-learning, I would go into these e-learning groups and ask a question and immediately get an answer. And I was sharing with Alex earlier, probably one of our first conversations we ever had was he was talking about how to use chatbots within an e-learning course. And I said, could you tell me more? And he sent me all of the instruction that I needed to make that actually happen. And the community is really great about supporting each other. We're also great about tearing each other down. And you've got to remember that not everybody's been doing this for 20, 30, 40 years. Some people are brand new into it. And so when they go, well, hey, I just heard about the learning theories. What do you think? Well, hey, be gentle, right? You don't have to call them names. Just say, well, this was disproven, and here's why. Because the first time I heard it, it made perfect sense to me too, right? And so I believed it. And so be gentle with each other, but by all means, lean on each other to learn more and make the community better, make the community a lot better. And thanks so much, Alex, for having me.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Bruce. That was a great closing thought. Folks, thank you for listening. And again, make sure that you tune in every 2 weeks here at Spotify or any other platform, YouTube as well, on the Style Learn channel. And you can check all the links in the description. This has been Alex and Tim Bruce. If I were faced with the problem of improving training, I should not look for much help from the well-known learning principles like reinforcement, distribution of practice, response familiarity, and so on. I should look instead at the technique of task analysis and at the principles of component task achievement, intra-task transfer, and the sequencing of subtask learning to find those ideas of greatest usefulness in the design of effective training. That is Robert Gagne, 1962, from his work on military training and principles of learning, published in American Psychologist. Why is this important? Well, it's important because Gagne didn't publish his conditions of learning until 1965. So this was a revelation that led to his greatest work.